everyone, welcome back. One of the most frustrating things we hear from clients is some version of, I'm eating less than I ever have, I'm following low FODMAP, I've cut out sugar and junk, and somehow I'm still gaining weight. It feels backwards, especially when everything you've read about SIBO talks about diarrhea, malabsorption, and weight loss. When weight gain shows up instead, people often assume they're doing something wrong or that their body just isn't responding the way it should. So today, I want to talk through why this shows up for so many people, why it feels so confusing, and what actually needs to be addressed for things to change. Part of the confusion is that not all SIBO looks the same. There are different subtypes, and methane SIBO is a specific type that behaves very differently from what most people think of as classic SIBO. And if you're not familiar with methane SIBO yet, I go into that more fully in my article called What is Methane SIBO and Why It's Often Missed. And I will link to that article in the show note if you need kind of an intro. But the key point here is that methane changes the picture in distinct ways. This mismatch between expectations and lived experience is especially common with methane SIBO. The dominant narrative around SIBO doesn't match what methane clients are living in their bodies, so they often get dismissed, told to track calories more closely, or advised to keep cutting carbs without anyone stepping back to assess motility, inflammation, or just the bigger picture. And in our GI focused dietitian practice, we work with methane SIBO clients every single day. And this pattern is so consistent that when someone mentions constipation, bloating, and unexplained weight gain in the same sentence, methane is immediately on my radar. I'm thinking of a client who came to us after gaining nearly 18 pounds over 2 years while eating what she described was the cleanest diet of her life. She rotated the same few low FODMAP meals. She skipped breakfast most days because she was told that intermittent fasting would help with weight loss. And she relied on almond milk lattes and rice cakes to get through the afternoon without discomfort. Her digestive symptoms were brushed off because she wasn't having diarrhea and she was repeatedly told to lower carbs and reduce her portions, which only made her digestion slower and her food fear worse. What finally clicked for her was when we helped her understand that methane SIBO behaves differently. Methane slows the gut, it increases fermentation and inflammation, and changes how the body responds to energy intake, which means that the usual advice can actually backfire. And that's why I've spent so much time creating methane specific education, because the guidance around generic SIBO often misses the mark for this group. And throughout this talk today, I'm going to point you toward some other resources as well that walk through what actually works for methane. So today we're going to walk through why methane SIBO so often drives weight gain, why common advice falls short, and what actually needs to be addressed for things to change. So the question is, can SIBO cause weight gain? And I'm going to say yes, and methane is likely the culprit if you're experiencing that. When we see this pattern clinically, methane is very often the reason. And this is one of the biggest misconceptions we spend time untangling with clients because most people have been told that SIBO automatically equals weight loss. And that's simply not true, especially when methane is involved. And methane itself is not the villain because small amounts of methane in the gut, they actually serve a purpose in our bodies. It's normal to have small amounts of methane gas production, and that's actually helpful because it naturally slows digestion just enough to give us time to break food down and absorb the nutrients appropriately and actually use what we eat. And without this braking system, food would move through too quickly to be properly digested and utilized. The problem starts when methane producing organisms overgrow and that normal slowing becomes excessive. When digestion slows down too much, food sits in the gut longer than it should. And that extended contact time means the body has more opportunity to extract and store usable energy from food, even when intake is relatively low. For someone with methane SIBO, this helps explain why eating less or tightening portions doesn't lead to weight loss the way it's supposed to. Your system is simply extracting and storing energy more efficiently than intended. At the same time, that slowed environment sets the stage for ongoing low-grade inflammation. When food and microbes sit in the gut longer than they should, more inflammatory byproducts are produced, and the gut lining stays in a more activated, irritated state. As that irritation disrupts the gut barrier, this constant immune activation can lead to metabolic endotoxemia, which simply means inflammatory signals from the gut start affecting the rest of the body. And this is where things really start to shift. Inflammation changes how the body handles insulin and energy, and it nudges calories towards storage rather than use. And that's why someone can be eating carefully, exercising, and doing everything they've been told to do, yet still gaining weight or feeling stuck. And this piece is rarely explained, and it's what makes methane related weight gain feel so confusing and resistant to standard advice. This is also why methane SIBO looks very different from hydrogen dominant SIBO. Technically, methane is produced by a group of organisms called archaea rather than typical bacteria, but it's often grouped under the SIBO umbrella for simplicity, even though the treatment considerations are very different. Hydrogen patterns tend to be faster and more reactive, while methane is slower, more inflammatory, and more metabolically disruptive. In our practice, we see this distinction every single day, and once methane is correctly identified, the weight story finally starts to make sense. And if you want to understand how we address methane SIBO at the root, not just manage symptoms with diet, I walk through that in much more detail in our methane SIBO treatment article, where I explain how we work with these mechanisms and outline clear, actionable steps to calm inflammation, restore motility, and support real progress with methane-related symptoms and weight changes. So I've put the link to that article in the show notes. And I also have a separate podcast episode on methane SIBO and how to address it naturally that walks through why many standard approaches fall short and how we think about addressing overgrowths more strategically. And I'll link to that one in the show notes too. So now that we've talked about why methane can drive weight gain, let's talk about why diet alone often backfires in this situation. So, this is where so many well-intentioned people get stuck. When weight gain shows up, the reflex is almost always the same: eat less, cut carbs, tighten the diet, double down on low FODMAP. And to be clear, this approach makes a lot of sense. When symptoms flare after eating, food becomes the most obvious thing to control, and early dietary changes often do bring short-term relief. It also reflects how often people with methane SIBO are given standard weight loss or IBS advice that doesn't account for slowed motility and inflammation. The problem is that with methane SIBO, relying on diet alone, especially when it becomes more restrictive over time, can push the system further in the wrong direction. Here's why. Methane already slows gut motility. When calories drop too low or carbs are aggressively restricted, the body perceives stress. Stress hormones rise, the body downshifts metabolically, and motility can slow even more. Now you have a gut that's already sluggish paired with underfueling, which is a perfect storm. Digestion becomes less coordinated, inflammation stays elevated, and the body gets even more protective about holding on to energy. From the outside, it looks like someone just needs to be more disciplined, but internally, the system is doing exactly what it's designed to do under perceived threat. And we see this pattern constantly. I'm thinking of a client who came to us eating the same 3 meals on rotation for months. Breakfast was black coffee because carbs felt scary. Lunch was eggs and zucchini. Dinner was chicken and rice. All her food was carefully weighed. She was diligent, consistent, and exhausted. Over time, her bloating worsened as the day went on. Constipation became more stubborn, and her weight crept up anyway, even though she was eating far less than she used to. Foods she'd relied on for years, like oatmeal or sweet potatoes, suddenly started causing more bloating and discomfort, which made her feel like her body was becoming more reactive the harder she tried. The more restrictive she became, the worse her body responded, which only made her feel like she needed to clamp down harder. And this is where our work with Methane SIBO clients often starts, not by restricting food further or adding more diet rules, but by addressing the physiology that's been driving the whole pattern in the first place. And that means helping the body feel safe again, fully supporting motility through the entire digestive tract, including the stomach, small intestine, and large intestine, and actively clearing the organisms that are overgrown. Just as importantly, it means identifying and addressing the root causes that allowed methane to take hold in the first place, so this doesn't become a cycle of temporary improvement and relapse. Until those pieces are addressed, diet alone can only do so much. You can eat significantly less, cut carbs further, or rotate safe foods endlessly and still see the same outcomes: ongoing inflammation, disrupted insulin and metabolic signaling, and a system that continues extracting and storing energy very efficiently. That's why weight gain or resistance to weight loss can persist even when you're not eating very much. The physiology underneath hasn't changed yet. That's why. And this is also where diet fits into the picture in a very specific way. A methane SIBO diet can be an incredibly helpful starting point to calm symptoms, reduce fermentation, and support motility from a food standpoint. I have created a methane SIBO diet plan that's designed with that in mind, and we will link to that in the show notes as well. But in many cases, more than just diet is needed. Targeted supplements, sometimes medication or prescription antibiotics, and a clear sequenced plan to address methane at the root is often required. I walk through exactly how we approach this in the methane SIBO treatment article in the show notes. So this is the loop we see people get stuck in over and over again. Methane slows motility, digestion feels heavier and more inflammatory, weight creeps up, so food gets restricted further, which slows motility even more. From the outside, it can look like someone just needs to try harder, but from the inside, it's a physiological feedback loop that discipline alone won't fix. So, breaking that cycle is the core of how we work with Methane SIBO clients, and it's why addressing motility, inflammation, and root causes together matters so much more than simply eating less. Another big misconception I want to clear up is the idea that Methane SIBO is solved with a single round of antibiotics. So now I want to talk about why treating methane SIBO is about more than just killing bacteria, because this is another place where a lot of people feel blindsided. Many of our clients come to us saying some version of, I already did antibiotics, or I took rifaximin. So why am I still dealing with this? It was treated. On paper, methane SIBO can look like a problem that should be solved with a single round of treatment. In reality, methane rarely works that way. One issue we see all the time is that methane requires a very specific approach. Rifaximin alone typically is not enough to kill off the methane producers, and the combination and sequencing of therapies matters. We go into details of this more in our methane SIBO treatment article and in the related podcast episode, which we are linking to in the show notes. But I want to discuss it a little bit here and the key point is that methane behaves differently and treating it effectively often requires more than one tool used thoughtfully together. Another piece that's often missed is severity and dose response. Methane overgrowths are frequently higher and more stubborn, and in most cases, it takes more than one round of treatment to see meaningful, lasting change. The higher the methane levels, the more likely it is that back to back rounds are needed rather than just a single attempt. When people are told one round should fix everything, it sets them up for frustration when symptoms linger or return. And this is also why relying solely on repeated prescription antibiotics isn't always realistic or appropriate. Many people don't want to do multiple rounds of antibiotics in a row, and for good reason. And that's where herbal and more natural antimicrobial strategies often play an important role, either alongside or following prescription options to continue addressing methane while being more supportive of the gut microbiome. The goal is strategic, sustainable approach that actually holds, not just repeats short-term suppression, because we do see with SIBO, including methane SIBO, a very high rate of relapse or just poor outcomes when just one round of treatment is used. And what tends to make the biggest difference is stepping back and looking at the full picture, using the right tools in the right combinations for the right durations while also supporting motility, digestion, and nourishment, and addressing the root contributors that created a landscape where methane was allowed to overgrow in the first place. Without that piece, it's easy for symptoms to improve temporarily and then slide back into the same pattern. All right. And once again, if you've tried antibiotics or diet changes without lasting results, definitely check out our deeper walkthrough, whether it's in the article or the podcast episode of how to fully address methane, where I go into more detail than I did just now. All right. Now let's talk about where the methane SIBO diet helps and where it can't do the heavy lifting. At this point, a lot of people are probably wondering one very practical thing. Okay, but what do I actually eat when I'm dealing with all of this? And that's where the methane SIBO diet can be genuinely helpful as long as it's used for the right reasons and with the right expectations. The role of a methane SIBO diet isn't to cure the overgrowth or force weight loss. Its job is to create stability. It gives structure when digestion feels unpredictable, helps calm symptoms related to fermentation, and supports motility from a food standpoint so meals feel less reactive. For many people, it's also the first time food feels a little less scary, which matters more than most people realize when weight gain and restriction have been intertwined for such a long time. And if you're looking for something you can use right now to feel more grounded with food while you work through the bigger picture, I've put together a methane SIBO diet plan that's designed exactly for that. It's different from a lot of generic SIBO plans because it's designed specifically for methane, meaning it supports motility and reduces fermentation without pushing people into deeper restriction. And we are linking to that as well in the show notes so you can take a look if it feels helpful. What's just as important is what the diet is not. It is not meant to be permanent, and it's not about shrinking the diet further or chasing more restriction. The goal is actually the opposite, to stabilize symptoms enough that we can expand tolerance over time and support the body while deeper work is happening. When used correctly, the diet supports the process instead of becoming another thing that keeps methane stuck. And that's exactly how our methane SIBO diet plan is designed. It's meant to be a supportive starting point, get you some relief, get you some stability, start supporting your motility, but it's not a long-term solution for methane SIBO or a replacement for addressing methane at the root. If you're looking for something to implement right now, though, to kind of feel more grounded with food while you work through the next steps, definitely download the methane SIBO diet plan. It's often the bridge that helps people feel steady enough to move forward without digging themselves into deeper restriction. Now, if you're listening to this and thinking this sounds uncomfortably familiar, that might be a sign that you're in the right place, right? Methane SIBO often shows up as weight gain or stubborn weight resistance alongside constipation, bloating that worsens as the day goes on, and a sense that your body doesn't respond the way it should to eating less or eating clean. Many people also notice that the harder they try to control food, the more reactive their digestion becomes. It's also very common to feel stuck or confused at this stage. You may have tried low FODMAP, intermittent fasting, supplements, antibiotics, or multiple diet changes, and still feel like nothing quite explains why your body is behaving this way. And that frustration is not a failure on your part. It usually means the underlying driver hasn't been fully identified or addressed yet. And this is exactly what we help with in our practice every single day. And let's talk about when it is time to get some individualized help. If you've tried changing your diet, you're cycling through supplements, or even going through treatment rounds, and still feeling unclear why things aren't sticking, that's often a sign that you need a more personalized, sequenced approach. Methane SIBO is rarely a one size fits all situation, especially when weight gain and metabolic resistance are part of the picture. So, working with a practice like ours allows us to step back and look at the full context, your symptoms, your history, any past testing, and the patterns that point to why methane developed and why it may be persisting. And if methane hasn't been clearly identified yet, we can help guide appropriate testing as part of that process. From there, we can prioritize the right supports in the right order rather than layering more things on top of an already stressed system. And if you want help connecting the dots on your own situation, feel free to book a strategy call. We have the link to book that call in the show notes, or just explore the other resources that we've linked to. All right, guys, thanks so much for joining today, and we'll see you next time.